Hey, welcome to the channel, or welcome back to the channel. I'm Nick, and I make a new video every week about things that I like. Be it gaming or design, you can find a little bit of everything here. If that sounds interesting to you, go ahead, don't be shy, like, subscribe, and don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a video. But now, on to the video. Allow me, if you will, to be a bit hyperbolic. I think, in general, there are two types of gamers when it comes to actually finishing games. First, we have people who buy maybe at most 5 games a year and really spend a ton of time on each one. They dive extremely deep into lore, they find every secret, they beat every boss, they explore every dungeon. A lot of them probably even play through multiple times to see what different playstyles are like. These are what most would refer to as completionists. People who play games all the way through and really want to make sure they maximize their time with each game. Then we have people more like myself. People who just really love the medium of video games and can't wait to try a new, interesting take on a genre that jives with us. For me personally, those are things like survival crafting, art house indie titles, Metroidvanias, or anything that kind of feels like watching a movie. We might be able to call these gamers, I don't know, Renaissance gamers. We're a jack of all games, but a master of none. And these are the gamers that we'll focus on in this video. This dichotomy arises in any hobby or point of interest, really. A good corollary, I think, is in literary circles. I follow a few booktubers, and something I always like hearing them talk about is something that they refer to as their DNF, or did not finish list. And that is exactly what it sounds like. A bunch of books that they started, but for whatever reason, didn't finish. And interestingly, that doesn't mean that those books are bad. In fact, there's a pretty sizable amount of content centered around going back and completing their DNF, and talking about how great a lot of them are. And take a seat, because this one is a shocker, but there is a lot of elitism around finishing books within the bookish side of the internet. You'll have no trouble finding people deriding others for picking up a book but not seeing it through to the end. They would claim that you're not really a reader if you can't be arsed to finish what you started, regardless of if it's good or bad. And having a DNF is just a symptom of the TikTokification of reading, and how it's becoming more of a status/aesthetic thing, more than something that people do because they actually enjoy reading or enjoy the noble pursuit of knowledge. Now, are you still sitting down? Good, because this one's really going to shock you. And that is that the same thing exists in gaming too. I know, it sounds crazy, but there are actually people who will think less of you for not finishing your games. And for all the women out there in the audience, I'm sure you get more than your fair share of this kind of attitude from sweaty dudes on the internet, and for that, I'm very sorry. But does any of that hold water? Is it really fair to say that if you don't finish your books, that you're not really a reader? Or if you don't finish your games, that you're not a real gamer? No, of course not. For one, that's just not nice. And what the hell is even the point of drawing that line? Gaming is for everyone, and there should be absolutely no reason why someone should be considered less of a gamer than anybody else. However, it is worth asking why we don't finish these games. It's not a dumb question to ask ourselves, because I do think there are legitimately good reasons and bad reasons behind it for all of us. So let's explore why exactly it is we don't always finish the games that we start. Well, unsurprisingly, there are a few schools of thought on this, and because no thought is truly unique, let's take a look at what the internet has to say about the matter. I hopped onto the r/patientgamers subreddit after a quick Google search to check out what people are saying. From what I gathered there seem to be a couple of causes that we can point to. Something a lot of people brought up was, unsurprisingly, the time aspect. As many older gamers can attest to, the older that you get, the less time you have to play games, and that's normal. So that's a relatively unsurprising and pretty valid reason that people feel that they aren't finishing their games. But something that went along with that I didn't really expect to see was the idea that people felt that they have a shorter attention span than they used to. And they chalked that up to the internet and internet culture. But we'll put a pin in that for a second. The other big cause a lot of posts pointed to was about how games just aren't good anymore. The idea that you don't finish your games because they got boring, or you lost interest, and how big AAA games these days have settled into a formula and are just a few mechanics that are stretched out over the course of a 100+ hour game, to make you feel like you got your money's worth, even though you really experienced everything that the game had to offer pretty much at the first level. I can totally understand where that feeling comes from. One of the examples that's given over and over again when this topic is brought up is Ubisoft games. The fact that you're essentially doing the same thing repeatedly in a different environment until you get a big game over screen, be it climbing a tower or taking out a group of bad guys and capturing their base, you really only have a couple of gameplay loops and nothing builds on itself. And that leads to a boring and stale game that people bounce off after a couple hours of playing. Now, while I do understand this complaint, and obviously it's totally possible that some games just aren't good, I do think it's a bit dismissive of all the people who do like those games. And if you find yourself thinking that, I think it's probably a good question to ask yourself if this is really a bad game, or if maybe it's just not made for you. I think there is absolutely a value in games that don't really go that deep in terms of mechanics or gameplay loops, if the ones that they use are satisfying and enjoyable. Now, I could cite Mario here, and I think that would totally work, but I think I'm going to go with a more contemporary example, and that is the 2018 Spider-Man. I think this is a good example of exactly that. If you break it down, the gameplay can be summed up as go to place, fight guy, or pick up thing, and go to the next place. And sure, that does technically sum up the loop. You do just go from one place to the next, and in general, you do the same thing at every location, with slight variations to choose from the entire game. However, this game doesn't get the same criticism that games like Assassin's Creed and Far Cry do. And aside from the story actually being interesting and engaging, which is a huge help, this is because that simple and basic gameplay loop is fun. Swinging through the streets of New York is incredibly fluid, and getting good at it is really engaging. Sure, it won't resonate with everyone, but for people who do really like Spider-Man, just getting to exist in this world is enough. So I don't know that I personally really agree with that reasoning, because I think for most of the games that I have finished, the gameplay loops have been just as simple as something like Far Cry or Assassin's Creed. And most historically great games really are only a few mechanics, but they're significant because they execute so well on those few things. And on top of that, there are plenty of games with far more interesting and varied gameplay loops which I haven't finished. So, while I think it's certainly a fair criticism of the AAA games industry, and specifically Ubisoft, I don't think it does a good job explaining why we don't finish games. Plus, it does feel just a bit like a cop-out to just be like, oh, it's the game's fault, it's a bad game, that's why I didn't finish it. So that doesn't really seem to hold much water in my eyes. I would argue that the vast majority of games are not actually that bad, they're just not for us. So that leaves us with the claim that kids these days just don't know how to focus like they used to. Now, I'm no science communicator, and I'm still working on learning how to interpret research studies, so take everything I say about research papers with a grain of salt. However, when I heard this brought up on Reddit, I was immediately pretty reticent to believe it. It just doesn't make much sense to my brain that phones, computers, and the big bad internet could physically alter someone's brain chemistry enough to permanently shorten their attention span. I'm aware that it's a well-known and accepted phenomenon that notifications and other smartphone-related stimulus can induce a hit of dopamine, which can cause us to become addicted to checking our phone. So I'm not debating whether or not tech has the ability to affect our brains. But make us unable to focus as well as we used to? That claim just set off my juvenile alarm the instant that I heard it. And, dear reader, I'm here to tell you, I was right. Kinda. Okay, so as with all things in psychology, it's a bit more complicated than just a simple yes or no, black or white, good or bad. From what I gather from a meta-analysis of psychology papers and interviews with the psychologists who wrote those papers, as well as consulting my lovely girlfriend, who is currently in the process of getting her master's degree in psychology. It turns out it's not really that we're losing our ability for attention, just that distractions are more common and easier to access than ever before. And in many ways, the technology we use is wholly designed around us getting distracted and hopping from one thing to another. A lot of people will say that back in the day, people could focus for way longer than today, and they would spend hours studying something or reading a book or painting or something like that. And while I'm sure all of that is kind of true, it seems that it isn't really down to their brain chemistry so much as it is down to the fact that they didn't have multiple devices vying for their attention 24/7. A painter or carpenter didn't have a magic little box in their pocket that allowed any person or company to ping them and pull their attention away from what they're doing. And the technology they did use was designed to achieve the task at hand, not sell you something or get you to engage with it. From what I've found, it seems the scientific evidence is pretty conclusive that no, you're not in fact losing your ability to focus on things. It's more likely that the environment around you just needs a bit of tweaking. And we'll get back to that in a minute, but first I want to explore something that I found when I was looking into this part in particular. Something my girlfriend brought up when I asked her about this was an interesting phenomenon she learned about when she was getting her bachelor's degree from the University of Amsterdam. It turns out that, contrary to popular belief, when we're presented with too many options to choose from, we become far less satisfied and sure of the choices that we do make. This was shown through a couple of studies. When patients had a lot of choice, they reported feeling a lot less satisfied with the choices that they did make, whereas participants who were given far less choice felt more confident and more satisfied in their pick. Perhaps you can see how this might apply to the current games industry and why you probably felt a lot more connected to and satisfied with the games that you played when you were a kid. I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, there were far less games on the market to choose from. I grew up with a console, the original Xbox to be exact. A console that me and my brothers found at the local Goodwill well after its life cycle was over. And most of the games that we were able to afford were from bargain bins or, again, from Goodwill. And for my non-American viewers, Goodwill is just a secondhand store that's rather large here. I'm sure you have an equivalent wherever you are, so just substitute that here. But as a result of only being able to pick from a very limited amount of games, we found a few that we really enjoyed, and played through so many times I could probably still tell you the layout of every level. And there was no onus on these games to be good from a critical standpoint. We made the choice at the store, and then we had a good time with the game, and didn't think twice about what other options there were, because there really weren't that many others. But now, with the ever-growing digital storefronts on consoles and the absolutely gargantuan size of the library on Steam, is it any wonder we aren't really as sure of or satisfied with our choices in games? After all, when we start playing and then aren't immediately hooked, there's little, if any, barrier to just making a different choice and hoping that this one's better. And it's even worse if you have a huge backlog like myself, because then you don't even have the barrier of buying the game, you can just download it. And if you add on top of that the fact that we as adult gamers have far less time to spend playing games in the first place, it seems wild that we have the motivation to play them at all. So what am I saying here? Am I telling you that you should just not even bother playing games? That there's no point because you're not going to be satisfied with your choices anyway? Should you just give up and find a different hobby? Using what we've learned about the actual underlying issues here, I've come up with a couple suggestions that might prove useful to you. And these aren't proven, so please feel free to try them out and let me know if they do anything at all to help you. I'm going to be trying them myself and seeing if they have any effect, but I would love to hear if you all have had any different experiences, or other suggestions for ways to keep distractions to a minimum, so feel free to leave those in the comments. But the first, I think, would be to get rid of your second monitor if you have one. Yep, that's right. I think it might be very helpful to take that monitor and just unplug it, at the very least when you're actually playing a game. The reason I think this might work is that it should limit the ease at which you're able to be distracted by other content. I don't know about you, but for me personally, I don't play my games spanning across both monitors. So if I'm gaming, one is always just sitting on the desktop. And while I could certainly just not open up YouTube and play a video while I play my game, I think this is probably the #1 source of distractions for me personally. So getting rid of it entirely is something I think that I'm going to try giving a shot. Another thing, if you don't want to commit to removing your second monitor entirely because you use it for work, might be to install or utilize focus modes. If you're on Mac, there are some great tools built in, but for my Windows and Linux users out there, you'll probably have to do a bit more shopping around for third-party options. Regardless though, maybe try to identify which activities you usually engage in that distract you from gaming, and set up roadblocks for those things when you start gaming. And then, I think one of the most important when it comes to avoiding distractions is probably taking your phone, putting it on silent, and putting it way over in the other room or something. And that one's fairly obvious, and frankly you could probably just put it on silent and put it next to you, but you know, if you don't have anything important coming up, it might be a good idea to just put it in the other room. The last thing I want to try is artificially limiting the games that you have available to you. For me personally, Steam is where I get 90% of my games, and fortunately they give you the ability to hide games in your library. Now, this feature is, I think, intended for other purposes, but we might be able to use it to help restrict the amount of choice that we have. And in theory, that should help us feel more satisfied with and invested in the games that we do choose to play. And you could go one step further and just choose like 3 or 4 games to download and then commit to never opening Steam, or hide all your other games and force yourself to choose from those 3 or 4 every time you want to get some gaming in. And if you want to go even further, if you're on Windows, maybe try switching to Linux, or set up a dual boot, so when you game, you always have to go into your Linux drive. That way, the amount of games that you have available to play is limited for you by your operating system. Now, this is only a relatively temporary measure because game support on Linux will only continue to grow, but for now, I think it might be a fairly good option, actually. But that's just a couple of options that I came up with that you could give a try. Like I said, I would love to hear about how these work for you if you choose to try them out, so please let me know down in the comments. Regardless of if you try any of this though, I want to end this video by saying it's also totally fine to just not finish games. We've focused mostly on why we don't finish them and how we can remedy that, but it's also totally okay to just not. If that's how you engage with gaming, that's totally valid, and there's nothing wrong with you if you hop around from game to game. But if that's something that does bother you about yourself, I hope this video helped at least give you a bit of context for why that might be the case. But that's it for this video. I hope you found it informative and maybe a bit entertaining. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I hope you have a great day. I hope to see you here next week. And as always, happy gaming.